Was the sinking of the Titanic really an accident, hitting the iceberg that cold spring night? Or was it esoterically done on purpose for a more dark and sinister plan, a plan that might change your view on global politics forever? In April of 1902, J.P. Morgan's trust company, called the International Mercantile Marine, or IMM, bought the White Star Cruise Line. The final agreement was signed on May 25, 1902. J.P. Morgan wanted to monopolize water transport, just like he had monopolized the railroad system, to have direct control of the shipping prices of everything. But he was after another kind of control as well, thus being the first step in the master plan of the global bankers. On March 31, 1909, construction on the RMS Titanic began by a company called Harland & Wolff. This company had an exclusive deal with the White Star Cruise Line. The deal? Harland & Wolff agreed not to build ships for any of White Star's competitors, and in exchange, White Star agreed to build all their ships at Harland & Wolff. In November of 1910, something extremely strange happens. 6 men meet in secret, so secret that they only use their first names as to not incite public media. The location of their meeting? Jekyll Island. These men were Nelson Aldrich, U.S. Senator and Chairman of the National Monetary Commission. He was the political fixer and the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., Paul Warburg, a partner at the investment bank Kuhn, Loeb & Co., having immigrated from Germany with a deep knowledge of the Rothschild-style European central banking systems. Henry Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co. He represented the Morgan interests. Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, now Citibank, representing the Rockefeller family's banking power. A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. Benjamin Strong, an associate of J.P. Morgan, who later became the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And these men lay down a system of centralized private banking that is called the Federal Reserve, which will seem like a non-central, federally controlled bank. But on the inside, it will give the private U.S. European bankers a complete monopoly of the American economy. Let's take a quick step back and see who set these banking firms that were present in this secret meeting up to begin with. When we see what was being proposed as the Federal Reserve, it was basically identical to what the Rothschilds had created in Europe to become the central banks of the European countries, which ultimately gave them undercover control and power of the country's governments. The 3 banking families that were represented in the secret Jekyll Island meeting, the Warburgs, Morgans, and Rockefellers, were all at one point brought into economic power by the influence and funding of the Rothschilds. This was the Rothschilds' way of breaking into the U.S. economy undercover, knowing how badly U.S. citizens opposed the idea of a European-style central bank. Why and how did this Fed system mimic exactly what the Rothschilds had set up in Europe? The Rothschilds knew that by lending money to the government with interest, their money would be far more secure since it was backed by countries' bonds themselves, and they would effectively always have control of a government that constantly owed them money. So, through their banking connections in Jekyll Island, they set out to establish a similar system in America. And here is how it works. When taxes aren't enough to support U.S. spending, which they never are, the U.S. Treasury holds a public auction of Treasury bonds. This is effectively the U.S. government saying, "I owe you this, plus interest," and private banks like J.P. Morgan's firm buy them. Then the Fed buys these from the private bankers at a small upsell, which makes the private bankers a lot of money. Now that the Fed owns the Treasury bonds, the U.S. government owes the interest of these bonds to the Fed. And then the U.S. takes your taxes to pay back the Treasury bonds and interest that the Fed owns. Here is the catch. All of those private banks like J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, etc. are shareholders in the Federal Reserve. So when the U.S. pays the Fed back, The Fed then pays an annual 6% interest every year to its shareholders, which are the private banks, and they profit all the money. And when the US cannot pay back the treasury bonds, they have to borrow again and create and sell more treasury bonds to pay the old ones off. And the never-ending debt cycle continues while the private bankers sit and make all the profit. On top of that, the private bankers are allowed to park money at the Federal Reserve and earn interest from that money. So if JP Morgan decides to park $1 billion in the Fed, and the Fed is willing to take that money and pay them a 5% interest from the payback money they receive from the US government, then banks like JP Morgan would never lend to small businesses at an interest rate lower than 5%, knowing they can get it from the Fed if they park their money there. And the Federal Reserve controls the interest rate they give the private banks, which in essence controls the interest rates of the entire US economy, like housing loans, car loan interest, etc. And all this was the plan set forth by these bankers, backed by the Rothschilds in Jekyll Island. Although the bankers represented in Jekyll Island had a lot of power and money, they weren't the only ones with that power and money in America. There were two of the wealthiest men in the world, part of American finance, that the bankers feared would call their bluff and stand in the way of this Federal Reserve central bank. These men were John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man on the ship and one of the wealthiest in the world. As a massive real estate and fur magnate, he represented old money and independent American wealth that wasn't necessarily tied to the European banking cartels. Benjamin Guggenheim, a mining tycoon whose family wealth was immense. Like Astor, he was a titan of industry who operated outside the direct control of the JP Morgan and Rockefeller banking circles. Although these men never spoke out openly against the system, looking at their history, they were a liability to complete control of the Rothschilds and the bankers over wealth in America. And if they would have opposed the Fed, it would have been extremely difficult for the bankers to succeed. So, the bankers decided that they had to be removed. The Titanic was finally finished, and JP Morgan had a plan for it. They marketed the ship as unsinkable, and people thought that the ship would never sink. To make people feel even more safe, they got their most experienced captain for the first trip, Captain Edward Smith. To understand why JP Morgan chose Edward Smith, we have to explore the connection to the Vatican. In the 1906 edition of the Jewish Encyclopedia, the Rothschilds are mentioned as the guardians of the papal treasure. After the fall of the Knights Templar through a series of events, the Vatican ended up using the Rothschilds as their modern secret bankers. For the Vatican to have the power that they had during the Dark Ages, they needed to take over the countries of the world esoterically. And what better way to do it than to infiltrate and take over the monetary systems of the world through their secret society military, which is the Jesuits and Freemasons. Edward Smith, although the claim of him being a Freemason is widely debated, was considered the millionaire's captain, and many of his friends and officers were open Freemasons. For example, the Titanic's third officer, Herbert Pittman, was a confirmed member of Abbey Lodge No. 334. And it was discovered that the men who headed the British inquiry into the sinking, Lord Mersey, John Charles Bigham, and at least 2 of the 5 expert assessors, were high-ranking Freemasons. And not to mention Father Francis Brown, a Jesuit priest who was in first class on the Titanic's maiden voyage and who talked with Captain Edward Smith. He was told by his superiors to exit the ship at Queenstown, Ireland, the last place the Titanic stopped before sinking in the Atlantic. So, JP Morgan had everything set. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic was ready to set sail on its maiden voyage. But something strange happened. Some big players in the banking realm canceled their voyage for no reason, including JP Morgan himself. He claimed he canceled for illness, but reporters found him a few days after the Titanic left, seemingly in good health with his mistress. The rest of the high-profile people who canceled are Robert Bacon, the Morgan partner, Bacon was a former U.S. Secretary of State and a partner at J.P. Morgan & Co. The move, he canceled his reservation for himself, his wife, and daughter. George Washington Vanderbilt II, a member of the Vanderbilt dynasty, allied with the Morgan Rockefeller interests. On a cold spring evening in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on its way to New York, the RMS Titanic strikes an iceberg at 11:40 p.m., beginning the events that will cause the death of over 1,500 people, including two of the wealthiest men in the world, John Jacob Astor IV and Benjamin Guggenheim. Here is where the story gets interesting. Remember the captain we spoke about, Captain Edward Smith? He was given 7 warnings by surrounding ships to slow down for icebergs that were seen around the area. And what did he do? Nothing. He ignored them all and kept the ship at max speed, which was 22 knots. Why would such an experienced captain put his entire ship at risk like this? Because he had his orders, and he knew what to do. Just a little over a year later, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, which gave the private bankers all the power they needed to control the future of the U.S. economy, thus giving the Rothschilds and the Vatican families the leverage they needed to begin the next phase of their agenda, World War I. Although J.P. Morgan died before he got to see the Federal Reserve Act pass, he had laid the groundwork for the other private bankers and his son, who would take over the firm and lead it on in the next stage of American history. So again, we ask the question, did they sink the Titanic on purpose? Taking into account all these coincidences and nuances, I would say the plan was executed exactly as they drew it up. But I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And like the video if you agree, or send it to a friend who may be interested in this type of history. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next video.